Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's INE's free live webinar, Containers in the Cloud with Tracy Wallace. We're going to get started in just a moment. I just wanted to pop on really quick and give a couple of quick housekeeping items. First off, this webinar is being recorded. A copy of the recording will be sent to the email that you registered with if you're watching on Zoom. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, the copy of the webinar at the end will be sent out via social media channels. So you'll be able to check this out later on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit. So keep an eye out for that. It'll probably be a little bit later today, around 3 or 4 p.m. When that's ready to go out. Also, if you are watching on Zoom, you can ask questions to Tracy. There is a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Put any questions that you have for Tracy in there, and he will be able to take a look at them and answer them as they pop up. And then again, at the end of the webinar, he can go a little bit more in depth with those questions. If you are watching on Facebook, you can put your questions in the comments, and I will be checking that every now and then and moving those over to the Q&A so that Tracy can see them on his end in Zoom. Once again, thank you guys so much for attending today's webinar, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Tracy.
Hey everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good night, whatever it is, wherever you are. I'm Tracy Wallace, and I am going to be running this webinar, Containers in the Cloud, Building Applications with Azure. It's actually the second of 2 development-related webinars that I'm doing. If you didn't see the first one, it does not matter. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at some of the different options for actually running containers in the Azure environment. Now, I'm an Azure guy, so that's going to be the focus here. But reality is, if AWS, I'm sure Google Cloud Services as well, are going to have similar capabilities. And let's go ahead and move in. Now, there's a couple things that I'm not going to do in general. First of all, I will put up my smiling picture here that was actually taken by Brittany, our digital marketing expert, and only putting this up here so you can see my contact information. If you want to get a hold of me, by all means do. Feel free to send me an email. If you follow me on Twitter, I do try to keep up with our updates to our content, our cloud-related and specifically Microsoft Cloud-related content, and then also be more than happy to colleague you, which I guess is the LinkedIn version of friending on LinkedIn as well. All right, so that's the contact stuff, and that was always slightly creepy to me. Okay, what we have here, webinar topics, lots of demonstrations. So I am going to do, it probably won't be a 60-second overview, but I will, for anyone not familiar with the basics of containers, I will talk about that. I'm not going to go through the basics of cloud, because frankly, I've done that in quite a number of webinars, as well as quite a bit of our INE content. Then I'm going to go through the container services in Azure, and that is a bunch of bullet points, which I hate doing a bunch of bullet points, but it'll go pretty quickly, because really what I want to get to is taking a look at the demonstrations. And I've got about 6 different demonstrations. It's really 6 parts of the same demonstration, but we're going to go through and see the different ways that we can implement containers within the Azure environment. So let's go ahead and let's get started up by kind of overviewing what containers are. And I'm going to just do a real quick thing here. Okay, and I'm not going to start with containers. I'm going to start with something that may in fact actually predate you, depending on how long you've been around, and that would be physical computers. I know it doesn't actually predate you, but you may not have had to deal with them too much, right? If I'm running a physical computer, I can think of this as I've got a hardware layer, I've got a BIOS layer, I've got an operating system layer, I've got a services layer, and then finally on top of all that, I have my workload. Okay, and if I go back here, we've got hardware, BIOS, OS, services, and workload. We'll just say work. Right? So maybe I'm running a web application and I'm running it on a Linux server, running Apache or Nginx or whatever it is, right? I'm going to stack all that up, right? And then if I wanted at the physical layer, if I wanted to have another isolated service, I would have to have another physical box, right? Which is not scalable. So what we have instead is we have this concept of virtualization, right? And with virtualization, I've still got the hardware and the BIOS. Then I've got a virtualization layer. And then I've got these virtual machines. Okay, and within the virtual machines, well, let's go this again. This would be hardware. This would be the BIOS. This would be the container management system. If you're familiar, you're probably familiar with Docker, although it's technically the only one, it's the kind of the biggest one. All right, and then we'd have, excuse me, not Docker, I just went ahead of myself. Pretend you didn't see that. That is not that, it is a hypervisor. Hyper-V, VMware, or others. Okay, and then within the virtual machines, you've got layers. You've got the operating system, you've got the services, and you've got the workload. Right, and you're going to have that all over the place. Great. Now the problem is that's great, but these typically are, in the gigabytes in terms of the size of the image of these things, and the memory that they take, and you're loading the full kernel of the OS into every one of them. So as an alternative, now we have containers. And with containers, I've still got the hardware, and I've got the BIOS, and I've got the OS, and a container management layer. Then I've got containers. So we've got, again, HW, I'll just say B because you're probably tired of me watching this, OS, and this is my container management system, sometimes known as Docker to most people, right? And then I've got these containers, and what these containers have is customization and workload. Okay. Now, what they don't have is their own individual copy of the OS. And so what ends up happening is you get containers that are much lighter and much more flexible, right? And depending on the type of container that you create, they can literally run anywhere. I typically create Linux-based containers. I'm a .NET developer, so I'll develop things in .NET Core. The examples I'm going to show you are .NET Core. And I build that into a Docker-based container image, and then I can literally run that anywhere there's a container and not have to do anything with it. So if I'm going to deploy it into Azure, easy. If I'm going to deploy it into AWS, easy. If I'm going to run it on-prem, easy. It's scalable. It's honestly, it's amazing stuff. So I know that was more than 60 seconds. So my apologies on the on misleading you there, but that is really what we have with containers, okay, and why they're so powerful. All right, so now what I'm going to do is talk about some of the container services that we have within the Azure environment. Okay, one thing we have is an Azure Container Registry, and you have containers. Containers are the kind of executing workload. Okay, they're when it's active. Containers are generated based on images. And so, if I have this application, let's say I've got a web application and I want to be able to load it up as a container, what I do is I create an image of that. and then that image has to be stored somewhere. It's initially going to be generated locally on your own machine, and then you can push that up to what's called a registry. And Azure has its own registry as a service. It's based on Docker Registry 2.0, so it's standardized. It does use Azure AD authentication. It's using OAuth 2 token authentication that is started, if you will, by Azure AD. It actually has some extensions. It's pretty cool. You can have automated builds. So if I've got, let's say, an image that's based on another image, anytime that parent image gets updated, the child image would automatically rebuild. You can actually also tie it into code builds. So if you're using GitHub or if you're using Azure DevOps services, you can actually automate from the container services, the container registry, which is pretty cool. It is, as you will see, fully integrated with other container services, right? The container registry is kind of a key piece of actually using containers. And you want to have your registry secured, but it also has to be available and easy to use. And really, and you would see this in any cloud environment, but again, I'm an Azure guy, so you'll see it in Azure. But that's just you need that, and it's provided. Okay. A couple other things that's pretty cool. It's got vulnerability scanning, and what that does is it takes a standard vulnerability scanning tool that's integrated into Azure, and it's scanning images for known vulnerabilities. And what it does is actually looks, because there's all these public images out there, and anytime you build your own image, it's based on another image, which eventually goes up all the way up into the public images. And there's a list, if you will, of known vulnerable public images. And if your image anywhere up its chain is based on one of those, you can have it flagged. Okay. There's also network access control, and that's one thing that I've been really pretty happy with Azure about over the last several years. I'm sure it will be a great relief to Microsoft to know that I've been happy about this, but they're really implementing pretty much across the board good and simple network access control. So the Azure Container Registry by default has a public endpoint. But I can use either what are called public or private service endpoints. So in fact, I could actually tie that into a specific virtual network and make it only available within that virtual network or other virtual networks that are joined and not have a public endpoint at all. Or I could have tight control over access to that public endpoint. So lots of good stuff there. All right. Beyond all that, if you're familiar with containers, it's a registry. All right, now container instances. This is the quick and easy, hey, I've got a container, I need to run it. I don't really want to have to think about too much else. I can just go ahead and run it as a container instance. And you'll see extremely easy. It is integrated with Azure Container Registry. They start pretty darn quickly for your containers. They load up. One of the things, now Microsoft will tout this as a serverless solution. It kind of is, kind of isn't. It is still built on a capacity. So you say, okay, I want this much memory and I want this much processor available to this container instance, and you're built on that the entire time that container instance is running. But it is billed by the second, right? So if you've got a process, maybe you're doing, some data processing that you need to do on a periodic basis. You've got it set up in a container. And when you start this thing, run it. As soon as it's done, shut it down. You could do that. It also has network access control, same thing, and you'll see that across the board, same thing as Azure Container Registry. It also does have direct mounting of Azure files. Typically, if you've got a container will have access just like it would if it were running on a regular operating system. As far as your workload's concerned, it is a regular operating system, but those tend to be ephemeral. In other words, when you delete the container, everything that was stored in that container is gone. But you can actually integrate and direct mount Azure files, the Azure File Service, in a container instance. So if you want to, you can have durable storage. It also has hypervisor isolation. And really, if you look back to that, just absolutely amazing drawing. Yes, I'm kidding. I have no drawing ability whatsoever. But you know, when I looked at the progression from being, you know, just a single physical machine to a virtualized machine, where each virtual machine is running its own full operating system kernel, to a container environment where you actually have a shared kernel. Well, in some multi-tenant environments, that's unacceptable. And so the container instances actually have hypervisor isolation. So you're running it, and it is running within its own really full stack, full OS kernel, and it's not sharing any of the OS kernel with anything else. So that's container instances. And by the way, you're going to see each one of these things. All right, Azure Web Apps for containers. This is just a standard Azure Web App, and it's got all the Azure Web App features. If you're not familiar with an Azure Web App, it is designed to make it easy to deploy web-based workloads. And it is platform as a service. You don't have to worry about the OS. You don't have to worry about the services that are giving you web functionality. It's all just there. And you can use containers with that. And for a while, this was actually my favorite way of deploying containers within the Azure environment. So all the things, if you are familiar with web apps, you can do all of those things with Azure Web Apps for containers. And an Azure Web App for containers, just an Azure Web App, and you just, when you're configuring it, you set it up to be based on a container. So configurations, auto scaling capabilities, custom domains and certificates, TLS settings, and logging and diagnostic. Again, all these things you have, they're just there. They're given to you. Not surprisingly, integrates with Azure Container Registry. You also can either host up a single container, or you can use Docker Compose to host up multiple. I would not use Docker Compose because they've honestly flip-flopped on that a little bit. It went Docker Compose and Kubernetes to just Docker Compose, and it's in preview, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. Portal logging, you have to apply an extension within the server, but you can actually have your container level logging show up in the Azure portal. So you can kind of do that, which is cool. It's got great continuous deployment integration. I've used this before where I'm working locally. I've got an Azure DevOps, could be GitHub as well, or many others. I've got an Azure DevOps pipeline set up. So when I check code in, long story short, it ends up being both in an Azure Container Registry as an image and then fired up in a web app. So that's pretty cool. I will tell you, the initial load for a container-based web app is a little bit slow. I find it to be. All right, now the next one is Azure Kubernetes Service. And what I'm going to do first is I want to draw it out just a little bit. All right, so let's take a look at this. Okay, Azure Kubernetes Service is, when it comes down to it, a clustering environment. Okay, so I have these servers. Okay, now I have different types of servers. I have what is called master servers, which are actually not called servers, called nodes, and I have agent nodes. And as you would expect, the master server controls the agent nodes. And I'm not going deep into this because honestly, you don't necessarily need to go deep into this. Okay, and the master server has an API, a REST API, and there are CLI tools. And so essentially, you've got, and I didn't give myself a lot of room over here. I've got a developer over here. Happy developer. Okay, and the developer wants to deploy a workload, so they deploy the workload through the master. That workload ends up running in what's called a pod. And this is gross oversimplification, but that's the idea. Okay, I can have these pods which are running my containers. Typically, it's a one-to-one. Technically, it doesn't have to be. And then I also have these services which provide an endpoint for it. So if I have a web app, I can run that web app on a pod in Kubernetes, and then I can create a service for it so that it has an exposed public endpoint, and then I've got it running, pretty much that. Now, I will tell you, Kubernetes is simple as long as you are a 0.1% genius. It's a little bit complicated because it is a clustering solution. It's kind of cool. I have to tell you, personal opinion, I would have been really happy, and I may get people drop off because of this, if Docker Swarm had won, because I know Kubernetes does a lot more, but Docker Swarm was so much easier. Doesn't matter. Kubernetes is the de facto standard if you are using a large-scale containerized solution. There's another, I probably should have listed that. There's something called Service Fabric, Azure Service Fabric, that also can be used to run containers. But honestly, I cannot think of a use case where I would recommend Service Fabric for containers, simply because if you have a large scale container solution, you might as well go with Kubernetes because it's going to give you the most flexibility. It's everywhere. Okay, so that's the basics of Kubernetes. And we'll get into a little bit more of what we have there. All right, so Kubernetes, the great thing, I mentioned that Kubernetes can be kind of complex. I have set up Kubernetes from scratch in a clustered environment exactly, I believe, 0 times. I've set it up on a single machine, and that was painful enough. The great thing is this Kubernetes as a service. Azure is going to take care of all that complex stuff behind the scenes. It's still Kubernetes, but it's going to do that. Azure manages the master node or nodes, and the advantage there is that you're not paying for them as well as not managing them and upkeeping them and everything else. Agent nodes, you can set up as virtual machine scale sets. And what that means is you have the possibility of doing automatic scaling, performance-based scaling of the nodes. Also, separate from that, you have auto scaling of the pods. Kubernetes in and of itself has scaling of pods, which allows you to create multiple instances of a pod. You know, let's say you've got a service running in a container, which is a pod, and that service is taking resources. It needs to be multiplied out and run across different nodes. All right, you can actually have that just as part of Kubernetes, but the virtual machine scale sets allow you to actually also really scale out your nodes themselves. You can think of those as the physical components. They're virtual, but you can kind of think of it that way. You have integrated logging and diagnostics. Actually, by default, it's going to integrate with what's called log analytics workspace. And so you get good information there. You also have, not surprisingly, integration with Azure Container Registry. Network access control, same as the other options. I'm going to show you a little bit of that. I'm not going to go far down that road, but I will show you kind of where we've got the access control. And there's something called ingress controllers. If you're a Kubernetes person, this is going to really matter to you. You have the options. There's actually a Azure explicit or Azure exclusive option, which is this HTTPS or HTTP ingress controller, which would automatically create a unique DNS entry for every pod that you create or every service you create. But generally speaking, you're probably just going to go with the standard ingress controller, but there are other ingress controllers you can use as well. Now, everything I've talked about, the first 4 things I've talked about, those are all what I would call platform as a service. You're not managing the underlying virtual machines. You're not managing the OS. You can, in the case of Kubernetes, you can connect to it, but there should honestly never be a reason for you to do that. And it's all done for you. Now, if you need or want more control, there's always the Azure virtual machine approach. And really, I can take an Azure virtual machine, and whether it is a Linux virtual machine or a Windows virtual machine running in Azure, I can set up Docker on that machine. There's some limitations, not limitations, but some requirements as far as the Windows setting it up, but it's really quite simple to do on a Linux machine. Honestly, if I'm using containers, unless I have a really good reason to, don't tell Microsoft I said this, I'm going to use Linux containers all the time. I don't have to worry about licensing. And frankly, it's just a little bit simpler, and I'm a Windows person. All right, what I have here is, I'm not going to go through this in depth, but this is actually a install script that I've used for the demo that goes through and it installs two things. It installs Docker, and then it also installs the Azure client, the Azure CLI. Now, the reason I have it installing the Azure CLI is right down here. Because the Azure Container Registry will authenticate using an OAuth 2 token that is generated by Azure AD. Right? But in order not to have to go through that process of doing all of that manually, generating the token and using the token, there's some tools in the Azure CLI that make it a bit easier. There's AZ login, that would log me in as myself, and then the AZ ACR login, what that does is that logs me into the Azure Container Registry. Once I'm logged into the Azure Container Registry, then I can pull images from that and just run it under standard Docker. And the cool thing is I actually only have to run the ACR login one time. And once I've done that, then it's registered and that virtual machine is going to work and be able to pull down images, which is actually pretty cool stuff. So none of this is terrible. And literally, this is exactly what I ran this morning on a VM, on a Ubuntu 18.04 VM, by the way. There'd be slight differences depending on which of the different Linux flavors that you want to use. Okay, so that's the big picture stuff. Now, I'm not seeing any Q&A, so I'm assuming this is just absolutely so straightforward. There cannot possibly be any questions. So what I'm going to do, and I said that obviously if you've got questions, pop them in the Q&A. It's not going to interrupt the flow at all because I'll typically go into the Q&A at the end. Okay? And I do try to answer every question in the Q&A. I'm not going to promise I have the answer all the time, but I will actually go and look up the answers. Okay, but now we're going to get to the fun stuff halfway through. Okay? We're going to do 6 different demos. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with a container image build locally. That's not an Azure thing, but I kind of want to show you the process all the way through. Okay, and then I'm going to provision an Azure Container Registry. I'll provision Azure Container Instances. I will provision an Azure Web App for containers. I will provision an Azure Kubernetes Service, and I'm going to demonstrate on an Azure virtual machine, okay, what I did and how it works. Now, I will tell you that this is a little bit of a cooking show demonstration. If you've ever watched cooking shows where they put this recipe together and they throw it in the oven and then they immediately pull it out done because I already had one that was done. It is entirely possible that that's what this is going to be. I'm going to go through the process, but some things like installing Azure Kubernetes Service, the install process takes several minutes, and that's really boring to watch. So I think it'd be a little bit easier if we go from show you the process to get there, but then show you what's already there. All right. So now what I want to do is let's bring up this guy. Okay. What you see before you is Visual Studio Code. Okay, I am a .NET developer, and I do other languages, but if the it's got to be done, it's got to be done tomorrow. I'm going to just use ASP.NET Core to do what I'm doing. Doesn't matter though, right? Once I get a container, it literally doesn't matter what went into that container. It could be ASP.NET Core, it could be a SQL Server, it could be MySQL, it could be, whatever it is, doesn't matter. Once I have a container, then I'm just taking that container and putting it where I want to put it. So I've got a couple of different applications, okay? And in fact, what I will do here is, because I didn't really do this, I'm going to whiteboard everything for just a moment. just so I can kind of show you the architecture here of my very complex applications. Okay, so I've got an application. There's kind of three components to it. Okay. And the backend component is a Cosmos DB document database, which you really don't have to care about. Okay. And my I have a service or an API layer providing a REST API in front of that. And I have a web app in front of that. Okay, so the web app is going to communicate with the REST API. For all its activity, the REST API is going to communicate back to Cosmos DB. Very simple. That is what we've got going on. Okay, now where I am at the moment, I am in my project. I'm not even sure. This is the API, and this is what's called a Docker file. And the Docker file is going to allow me to build an image. And really, the way I would build that image, let's see here. There we go. I could say Docker build and dot. Oh, Docker build -t demo API dot API. There we go. Hey. All right. Unable. Oh, that's because I'm not in the right place here. CD. Try that again. There. All right. So that is creating an image. Okay. And if I wanted to, I'll bring up another tool here because it's one I'm going to be using more. My handy dandy PowerShell interface. Let's see here. There. All right. So if I want to see my images, there's two images. Now, what's interesting is I just created the restaurant API. You just saw me run that. It legitimately ran, but I haven't made any changes since the last time that I built it, and Docker's smart enough to say there's really no reason to do this. Okay, so I have these two images, and these are going to be the backbone of my application. They were both built using the Docker files, really exactly as you see here. And I will also tell you that I completely cheated, and I let the tool build the Docker file for me and just edited it a little bit after that. Okay. So that's getting the images. So that's step one. Okay. And again, I know I went through that really quickly, but that really has nothing to do with Azure. I just wanted to show you where they came from. So when we actually see this, hopefully it will make all kinds of sense. All right, now I'm going to go and I'm going to create some stuff. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create a resource. And I am going to create a container registry. And there's my container registry. And I'm going to create. All right, and I'm going to create a new resource group for this, INE webinar demo. If you're not an Azure person, none of this is terribly complex. That's just a way of organizing your resources. All right, this has to have a name. We're going to say INE webinar demo. That name has to be globally unique. I'm going to put this in East US because everything is in East US for me. And different SKUs, I'm going to go with premium because it's not my money, it's my company's money. All right, no, you get some things with premium that are pretty cool. All right, now networking, one of which you get is endpoints. All right, so I have the ability to restrict network access. So I can go and I've got private endpoints, and I've got a public endpoint, or I can set up a private endpoint and do a little bit more as well. I have the ability to manage my own encryption key. The images are all encrypted in Storage, by the way, is automatically geo-redundant. You can also actually have geo-redundant copies of the registry itself. And we're going to leave it there and review and create and create. Now I'm going to give this a moment, even though I've already got one. Actually, no, I'm not going to give it a moment, but oh, there we go. What do you know? I'm going to give it a moment. All right, so here is my container registry. All right, right now, I don't have any repositories in here because I haven't added anything in. But what I could do is I could go ACR, log in, if this is right. G is going to be INE webinar demo. And the name is going to be INE, hopefully. Having some typing issues there. Sure, yes. Okay. Okay. Now, I have logged in, and I didn't actually need to use the resource group name, which is fine. Okay. So now, what I could do is I could actually push my images up to that repository. Okay, I'd have to tag them with the right name and push them, or be kind of lazy and go over to Docker over here and refresh my registries. So there's the INE webinar demo that I just created. And I've got my images up here. And so somewhere I've got my restaurant. There we go. There's my restaurant API. Let's use the tool. I'm going to push INE webinar demo. That just saved me like 2 steps. Okay. But what that's going to do, it's going to get that image up into a registry. And you can see it's pushing, and by the way, it's pushing multiple things because each one of those is an image that another image is built on, and all of those are going to be in what's called a repository within that registry. Okay, so I've got my images up into ACR. Much more I can do with ACR, right? But again, it's a webinar, it's a few demos. All right, now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and I want to provision an ACI, Azure Container Instance. Now, the way I'm provisioning it right now is just through the portal, because honestly, I think that makes a little bit of a better visual demonstration. You can also do this from the command line. In fact, if you do it from the command line, I can actually have a container instance that runs multiple containers that I could scale as a unit, but I don't really need to worry about that for this. Container instance. All right, so now I'm about to have a container that's going to be running. Okay, so we're going to put this into INE webinar demo. Have this container name be API. Okay, then a little bit of integration here. Azure Container Registry, that's where this thing is. All right, let's see. Oh, I don't have the admin user configured. All right, INE demos. And I want strike 2. We're going to get this eventually. INE webinar. There we go. I want restaurant API. Okay. And I've got the latest tag. So what? Now, the size, I've got 1 vCPU and 1.5 gigabyte of memory. I can change that. So if I've got something that I know is going to be a pretty serious workload, I can definitely increase that or decrease it. And I can also actually have dedicated GPUs. That does get expensive, but it does give you that opportunity, that option. And next, I'm going to go networking, and I'm going to make this public, and I'm going to go INE webinar demo. Okay, ports that I want open and mapped, I'm going to use port 80. And then I can go to advanced and I can do things like environment variables. So for example, I've got, if I look at my actual application, I've got some environment variables. I've got connect and DB and container. And so I could go and add the connect. And I'm going to just put in garbage right now. And then I could do the same thing for the database and the container, which would be restaurant DB and restaurant container. But what this is doing, it's creating environment variables. And that way, if you get an application that works with environment variables, it'll pick up those values. And that's actually how I am working with this. Okay. And then at that point, I would review and create. Okay. But I've already got one of these. So let's go take a look at that. But literally beyond, I did two things a little different. One, I put in actual values for the environment variables, and I actually hit review and create. Otherwise, what you're about to see is exactly the same. All right, here I've got a container instance. I've got this restaurant API. Okay, I can view my container. I can see it's running. I can see events that have occurred. I can see log information. This is actually the log information coming from the container itself. So this is going out to the standard IO. It's picking up the standard IO from that container, which is pretty cool. All right. And I can actually connect to it running bash, which is pretty awesome. Okay. Let's not connect to it though. So you have the ability to get in. You probably don't need to do it. But you could get in directly into the container if you needed to. All right, I see the image that's running. Now what I want to do is I want to take the IP address, copy that, and I'm going to test it out. Move this so you can see it. API / get types of food. All right, there we go. The restaurant API has a method that will return all of the food types that it has in its database. And so I can just see that's working. I haven't locked this down at all. But you obviously can. Okay, so there we go. I've got my container instance. It's running, it's functional, outstanding. Now, the next thing, so we're actually 3 down, 3 to go, right? So we've looked at building an image. We've looked at interacting with the Azure Container Registry to get an image up into Azure. And now I've got an Azure Container Instance, which is running a container based on an image that's in the Azure Container Registry. So it's all nice and neatly tied together. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to provision a web app. So we're going to go here and go web app. Okay, and we're going to put this in INE webinar demo. Give this a name. INE webinar demo. And the very difficult process to make this a web app for containers is I click Docker container. And I specify I want this to be a Docker container for Linux because it's cheaper. Go East US. Okay. And I actually already have a plan. I can create a new plan. Okay, but I'll use the existing plan. This plan is a premium. No, you know what? I'm going to use a new plan just to be on the safe side. There, easy enough. It is a premium V2 plan. I can change the size and thus change the capabilities. It says, okay, you made it Docker, so now you are going to have to tell us what you want. Okay, and options, it can be a single container or Docker Compose. Again, I would not recommend going with Docker Compose right now. I like Docker Compose, but I'm not sure that's going to end up being the thing they have at the end. and it'll probably end up being Kubernetes. But because I'm going single container, I have to tell it where it is. And I've got options, including Docker Hub, which is public. I could have my own private registry, in which case I have to supply the credentials for it. But what I want is an Azure Container Registry. And I am going to select my existing registry. And I'm going to select Restaurant Web App. And I want the latest. Okay, easy enough. Next, monitoring, because this is Linux based, I can't automatically hook in my application insights. I'm going to review and create, and this one I can create, but I am going to switch over to my other web app that I've already created. Okay, so that's exactly the process that I went through for the web app I'm about to show you, and then I'll show you the other things that I did. Now, the cool thing about having it as a web app is I can go in here, and first of all, if I need to scale it, I can scale out. I can manually scale. I need multiple instances. Got it. I can set up auto scale. Easy, done. It's scaling. I'm controlling it. Fantastic. I can also change the plan that it's on. So if I want to spend more money, get a little more functionality or less money, I can do that. Then I can set up my networking so I can restrict access to this. One of the things that I do in many of the demos in INE courses is I'll set up a web app and I'll put it in front of a application gateway, which has a web application firewall. So I've got that built-in layer of firewalling in front of my web app, and I could do that with a web app based on containers. So the point here is that if you are familiar with Azure, and if you're familiar with app services, once you've made that one selection to say, hey, it's a container, and pick the container, it's pretty much the same. Little things here and there, a little bit different. I'll show you that in a moment. Okay, but things like configuration. Okay, now this particular application, I've got two settings that my application looks for. It looks for a restaurant API service host and a restaurant API service port. Okay, so if I go there, that is the container that I showed you that was already deployed. Okay, and the port is just port 80. I don't know why it always wants to do that. There. I was going to get to that. So it's port 80, easy enough. Okay, so I set that. Now, other things I can do, like I said, if I want this to have a custom domain, fine. You know, I can control my TLS settings for it. I can add bindings, and so just, you know, again, pretty much whatever I need to do for a web application, I've got all those capabilities right here. There are some container settings. And you can actually change this around a little bit. Now, I don't have an extension installed, and it'll tell me right at the bottom here that logging is not enabled for this container, and it actually gives you a link. If you want to add logging, you can. And I've done that. It's cool, but it's not something I would say is massively important. Okay, now, what does this do? Because you haven't seen it. No pictures, it didn't happen. All right, here is my application. Now, I've got types of food. Remember, and I'll ask you to take my word on this, I have the API, and the API that I showed you, the call that I showed you, gave me types of food. Okay, well, that's what this calls. And then I could say, all right, let's go with Bangladeshi food. And in that database, there's 3 copies of the same Bangladeshi restaurant. Okay, I did not create this. Chinese, lots more Chinese options. Okay. And so in any case, what's happening is every time I change this, it's going in, making a call to the API, which in turn is making a call to the Cosmos DB database and returning that data. Okay, this is running in a web app. The API is running in a container instance. Right? And so there we go. We've got both of those. Now, the one thing with running it in a web app is that it's going to really use the HTTP transport. It could be HTTP or HTTPS, right? But if you're using something other than that as your transport, then you are going to not be able to use the web app. The container instance is just over top of TCP. So as long as whatever you're doing is on top of that, then you're going to be fine. All right. So now I've gone and we've looked at building an image. We've looked at container registry, setting up the container registry, loading an image up to a container registry. We've looked at container instances, and we've looked at the Azure Web App for containers. Now, the next thing that I want to do is show you Kubernetes. Okay? And I don't know if any of you have ever gone through and set up Kubernetes. Again, it can be a little bit complex. Okay? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and create a new service, and it's actually up here as one of the common services. I'm going to put this in my INE webinar demo. The Kubernetes cluster name is going to be INE webinar demo. And we'll put this in, not surprisingly, East US. All right, and then Kubernetes versions. I'm taking the default 1.16.10. You can see the other versions that are available. Now, if you're a Kubernetes person, say I use a different version than that, okay, that's cool. You can certainly do that, but you're going to be doing that at the VM level and installing it. And now I'm going to go down to one node, and I can set the size of the node. The nodes are just virtual machines. They're running, they're all set up. You can have node pools, and node pools allow you to define different sets of nodes, maybe that are running with different capabilities. Also VM scale sets, which is really all I want. Virtual nodes are pretty interesting. What they'll do is they'll actually integrate with Azure Container Instances. So if you have a load and the load exceeds what you want to run in Kubernetes, it can actually automatically spin up some container instances. But we're going to leave all that the same. Okay. Now, Kubernetes cluster, I want this to use a system assigned managed identity, and I want it to use role-based authentication, and my encryption type is going to be encryption at rest with a platform managed key. You can manage your own key, which you would do through Key Vault. Again, as with the other options, I've got some networking options here. Key networking option is the DNS prefix that has to be globally unique. Okay. And then I've got the network configuration. I've got basic configuration where I've got, you see, a number of options. If I go to advanced, then I'm going to get, well, much more. But just stick with basic, but you do have really tight control over how you want the networking to be set up. Okay. Now, container registry, that's kind of important. I'm going to go ahead and set that up as INE webinar pre-baked. That's one, again, set it up the same way, but it's all set up, has everything I want, right? And then I can set up log analytics, which I'm not going to do enough to even make that worthwhile. So we'll say disabled there, and then review and create. All right, and that is provisioning a Kubernetes cluster. Now, the provisioning process, once it switches over, this takes several minutes. I'm not going to make you wait for that. Okay, but I do already have my INE webinar Kubernetes cluster, and I can view my node pools here. I've got a node pool, agent pool. It's got one node running, which is standard D2SP2. Again, I set it up exactly the same way that I set this one up. And networking and scale. So if I wanted to auto scale, I could set that up as well. Okay, go up here to overview, get a bit of information. Now, what I want to do is I want to go in and interact with this a little bit. And so one thing I can do with that is I can go AZ, AKS, get credentials. Webinar pre-baked, an INE webinar. Now, what that's going to do, it's going to take care of all the hard work for me. It's going to go out and it's going to get my Azure AD credentials to that Kubernetes cluster. Okay, and then what I can do from there is I can do things like kubectl, which is the CLI for Kubernetes, get nodes. Okay, so I've got a node, and I could run kubectl, never sure how to pronounce that, get pods. I have no pods deployed. Okay, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy the same solution, but I'm going to deploy it as a unit into this Kubernetes cluster. Now, to do that, I'm going to use what's called a YAML file. Okay, and if you're not a Kubernetes person, this is just a bunch of words on a page, but this is standard. I could take this and deploy this to any Kubernetes cluster anywhere running on any platform that has access, most importantly, to the actual images. Okay, and here's my images. Okay, and they're running. There's my restaurant API. Now I spoke of environment variables with both the CLI and with the webinar or the web app. Okay, well, I have the same thing here. I have the ability to set environment variables, and I'm using environment variables to set the restaurant connect, the restaurant database, and the restaurant container. Those same things that we saw when I was looking at the container instance. Okay. And then I make them available through something called service. Again, not really terribly critical. Okay. And then a deployment for the web app. Okay. So this is just this is something called YAML, which is just massive fun to try to work with. But that's cool. All right. Now I've got that. How would I go about working with it? What I would do is I would say kubectl create -f. Let's see, what is it? Deploy. That was what it was. There we go. And it's running. Now, if I go kube get pods, kubectl get pods. And again, this is standard Kubernetes. Okay, I can see I've got both of my pods running. I can also check my services. And I see I've got a service running for Restaurant API, which is just an internal IP. And I've got a web app. And if I go and take a look at this web app, here's my URL of the web app. I go over here and navigate to that. There we go. All right, I've got my type of food. You can see, and there's a background process if you were watching. It took a minute, but then it came up with my list. Ooh, cakes. Okay, and then there we go. Again, this is the same process. So we've now seen this process running in a container instance and a container and a web app for containers. Right, the container instance has the API. The web app has the web app. And now I'm running both of these in Kubernetes. Now, one advantage of this is that they're talking to each other, and I don't expose the API to anything I don't want to expose it to. Now, I can control that with a container instance using service endpoints, but this is even a little more direct. Okay, so that gives us the container image build, the registry, container instances, web app for containers, Kubernetes service, and last but not least, Azure Virtual Machine. Now, if I'm going to deploy an Azure Virtual Machine, I'm going to go and create a resource and maybe create an Ubuntu server. And I'm honestly not even going to go through this process, but similar to the process that I went through for all of the other services I just showed you, I can walk through the process, put all the settings I need for a virtual machine. Now, this is a vanilla Ubuntu virtual machine. Okay, which I have one running. Okay, so I've got this virtual machine running, and I can connect to it. Here's a public IP address. I should already have, not too far down here. Let's clear that up a little bit. There we go. All right. I am going to establish an SSH connection. If you're not a Linux person, it just gives me a command line connection directly to the virtual machine. Okay. And so we're going to go ahead and do that. And I'm using a key pair. All right. So now I'm in. Okay. And what I did to get to where I am right now is I did exactly this. And this is really the same thing that was on the slide. Okay, I ran these commands in my virtual machine. So I updated, I actually ran apt instead of apt-get. I installed some prerequisites. I set up and added Docker as a key and a repository. Okay, I then updated again. I then installed Docker. Okay. Then this line here, I am installing the Azure CLI, and I'm installing the Azure CLI so I can use that to log into my Azure Container Registry. Now, if I was just running, let's say Docker Hub, something on Docker Hub or a private registry, I wouldn't need the CLI for Azure, right? But it's an Azure demo, so I kind of think it makes sense, right? And then I can simply run whatever that image is. And that is, like I said, exactly what I did. In fact, let's see here. So here I am running the web API. Okay, so I've got a sudo docker run. I'm running the, I'm running the web app. I have some environment variables that are pointed to the container instance, actually. Okay, and then right at the end here, oops, right at the end, that is the image that I'm using, which is the image that I pushed up into Azure Container Registry. Okay, now should already be running. So Docker PS. Okay, so that is running on my Docker machine. So I've run a very standard script to set this virtual machine up. Okay, it's a Docker machine, Docker host. Okay, and now if I go to its public IP address, I get exactly what you would expect. The same web app with the same functionality. Now, I could have gone ahead in my Docker virtual machine. I could have spun up the restaurant API, and I could have had the container that's showing me this web app. I could have that container connect locally to that API. It's all kinds of flexibility, right? I mean, I think that's pretty cool. It's been literally half an hour, and in half an hour, and this is not me, I promise, this is just the cloud. This is one of the super cool things about the cloud, particularly when using containers, is I was able to build an image. I was able to create a container registry, upload an image to the registry. I was able to create a container, have a container just run by itself using a container instance. I was able to host a container in a web app with all of the settings and configuration that's available to me within a web app. I was able, to be a little fair, I said within half an hour. If we had waited for the Kubernetes deployment, it probably would have taken a little bit longer. But the Kubernetes deployment process that I went through is exactly the process I went through this morning to set up the one that was pre-baked. And then, once I had Kubernetes, it was just a matter of deploying that YAML file and then using it. And then finally, if all of that just giving you too much and you want more control, you want complete control, just do it on a virtual machine. So lots and lots of options. This is an architecture that I am, if I ever have to go and get a real job again, definitely something that I would look for and push. Just a containerized solution. There's so many options with it, so many ways you can run it. And it hopefully, as you see, is a really natural fit with the cloud environment. I think it's a pairing that is absolutely powerful. All right, that is really all we have by way of demonstration and by way of webinar. Now, I was supposed to have a nice little slide up here that was open for Q&A, and I forgot to put it, but through the miracle of PowerPoint, it will look like I always had it. There we go. We got a Q&A slide now. I do not see any open questions on Q&A. So if you have any questions, now would be a good time to ask them. Otherwise, I hope you got something out of this. I had fun doing it. I hope you had a little bit of fun watching and seeing what all can be done with containers in the cloud. And Brittany, it looks like we might be about done here.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much for attending, and have a great day.